The world of antiquity, the Roman Mediterranean, did not decline, and in the East it did not fall for 1,000 years after they said it did. In the West it is more accurate to say that as a culture and a political structure, it transitioned through a succession of states, responding to internal conflict and external shocks, until it no longer looked and behaved like the classical world. Our civilization is the outcome of the European Middle Ages. In order to understand our medieval background, we must begin by forming an image of the late Roman world that it directly emerged from. One of the chief characteristics of the Roman Mediterranean was its social, cultural, and political coherence, its uniformity, encapsulated within the term Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire. The imperium was a true state, that is, it had a single government authority that superseded all others. It had a capital city and a centrally commanded standing army. It had an educated public administration based on documents and on a written legal code. It had clear and demarcated frontiers, up to which the writ of the central authorities ran without dilution. It had a single currency, with the head of the emperor stamped on all the coins circulating within this huge space. And we all know that this state covered a huge area. By 40 BC, the Romans had brought political unity and internal security to the whole Mediterranean, justifiably naming it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Crucially for our story, for the future of Europe, Julius Caesar saw fit to press north away from the Mediterranean and to conquer what the Romans thought of as further Gaul, a landmass far distant from the great watering hole of the ancient culture, the area that would one day become central and northern France. This conquest established the frontier of the Mediterranean world on the left bank of the river Rhine. The civilizational weight of Gaul, though, always remained in the Romanized south. Further campaigns brought present-day Switzerland, Bavaria, Austria, and parts of Hungary into the Roman world, establishing its northern frontier along the south bank of the river Danube, from the Alps to where it flows into the Black Sea. Long before, the city of Rome had destroyed its most dangerous rival, Carthage, and made North Africa too an extension of its own culture and way of life. Where the waters of the Danube and Rhine formed the northern, what we call the European, limits of the Mediterranean world, in the south that limit was set by the sands of the Sahara. Overwhelming military might is enough to conquer such an empire, but to keep it over many centuries, the tramp of legionary leather is not enough. To sustain a long-term polity, a political compromise must exist between the rulers and the ruled. The leading families among the conquered peoples must be given incentives to sustain the empire, to become stakeholders in the Roman project. They must accordingly, and as a condition, themselves become assimilated to Roman culture, to become, with the succession of generations, indistinguishable from their one-time conquerors. A crucial practice of the Romans, then, was to co-opt, after a decent interval, the elites of the peoples they conquered into their own high society. Here is the Emperor Claudius, arguing for the admission of the sons of prominent Gallic families into the Roman Senate. Quote, "All these young men of rank, on whom I cast my glance, you surely do not regret seeing among the numbers of the senators. Even the territory which is located beyond the province of Gallia Narbonensis in the south of France, has it not already sent you senators? For surely we have no regrets of going clear up to Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, for members of our order." End quote. This process of co-option created a single ruling class, a network of prominent families sharing an identical education and culture, speaking either Latin in the west or Greek in the east, and dominating the surrounding rustici of the countryside from the opulent and similar-looking cities that ringed the Mediterranean. By the end of the 300s, these elites had, through the pull of Latin and the integrative effects of service in the legions, brought about the extinction of the Celtic and Iberic languages in Spain and Gaul. This is why today, for example, Italian shares common roots with French, Spanish, and Portuguese. While the provincial elites became thoroughly Romanized in culture and outlook, they also, over time, tended to reassert their local loyalties. This new provincialism became marked after the turn of the year 300 AD. A major factor in this change of outlook was the impact of the great military and political crisis, which weakened the centre at Rome and led to the predominance of the officer corps of the armies in the political system. The way to the top at that time lay through a successful military career. The cursus honorum, the career of civic and military officers, once the monopoly of the educated elite, was no longer a guarantee of their members' political eminence and power. As more and more of the senior military officers were themselves soldiers from the provinces or, in the later 300s, Germanic barbarians, the army, the political system, and the imperial court tended partially to detach itself from the traditional landed and cultured ruling class. For example, a relative decline in the once godlike standards of sculpture is observable, which I attribute to this loosening of the political monopoly of those who most identify themselves with the cultural traditions of the classical Mediterranean. The crushing taxation needed to pay and provision the army, and to fund the expenditures of the imperial court, caused the flight of the ruling elites from the provincial Roman cities, who found that they no longer wished to seek traditional honours by showing largesse to their cities and acting as their magistrates, but who now preferred the otium, or leisure, of their villas in the country, worked by great masses of slaves, where they could walk in the peristyled garden, gaze in the carp pool, write to one's friends, and enjoy one's library. By the way, the Latin word otium finds its opposite in negotium, not to be at one's ease, to be at business, from which we get our term negotiate. Broadly considered, the harsh taxation of the later empire tended to hollow out the political life of the cities, and without its traditional, vigorous, and largely autonomous cities, parts of the society of Roman antiquity appears to have lost its dynamism, its powers to rebound after setbacks. Without its cities, to some extent, it lost its raison d'être. But so solid and eternal appeared the empire, to everyone within and outside it, that the withdrawal of the senatorial elites to their estates, and their usually successful lobbying at court to gain tax exemptions, did not appear to them to be undermining their own security. But inexorably it did. The military crisis of the late 200s saw numerous usurpers at the head of their frontier armies try to seize the imperial diadem. As effective power fell from civic society into the hands of the general staff of the army, so too did the fragmentation of power become more accentuated. The armies were concentrated on the frontiers. Their commanders, if they could ensure their troops' loyalty, were in a position to topple the emperor. For example, in 286 AD, a Roman general of Germanic descent, Carausius, took control of the fleet and legions of Britannia and Armorica, present-day Brittany, and declared himself Emperor of Britannia, and struck some very fine coins before being defeated. While civil war within the empire was endemic, barbarian tribes from beyond the frontiers marauded with impunity across the Roman provinces, plundering and burning as they went. In Gaul and elsewhere, bands of desperate peasants and the urban poor, who could not pay their taxes, formed brigand hordes, the Bagaudae, which took full-scale military intervention to suppress. By the 290s, authority had been re-established and security was restored. One of the emperors of the new order was Diocletian, who split the empire into east and west, and who pursued the most systematic persecution of the Christian sect in its already 300-year-long history. In the next generation, a rising general and politician named Constantine waged successful wars from present-day Iraq against the Parthians to Scotland against the Picts, and devastated the lands of the Germanic Franks on the lower Rhine. At his capital at Trier, Augusta Treverorum, he judged the captured Frankish war chieftains as criminals, not as enemies, with the sentence of damnatio ad bestias, exposing them to the wild animals in the arena. The fate of being damned lives on in the verbal memory of our civilization, through its Christianized use as damned to hell, and in our little expletive, damn. But soon Constantine, as a contender for power, had to flee the imperial court at Nicomedia, in present-day northwest Turkey, to join his father in Britannia at the other end of the empire. His father held there the office of Caesar of the Occident. On his father's death, he too allowed himself to be proclaimed by his troops at Eboracum, or York, as Augustus of the western provinces, and precipitated a civil war to make good his usurpation. On the 27th of October, 312 A.D., before the decisive battle over the Tiber, Rome, he had the haruspex, or pagan diviner, examine the entrails of a sacrifice. The news was not good. That night, however, he had a dream in which he saw the Christian symbol, the Greek letters for Christ, chi, rho, which looks to us with our Latin letters like P over an X, and heard the words, in hoc signo vincis, in this sign you will vanquish. The next day he won the battle. The imperial system had weathered the military crisis and had emerged in the early 300s seemingly as powerful as ever. But changes which had been occurring within society and in the army had accumulated and were soon to show their effect. Two radical new departures in the structures of the Roman Empire, which were to have enormous long-term historical consequences, were initiated by this same individual, the Emperor Constantine, who died in 337 AD. The first was his decision to allow the large and well-organized, but still very much minority, Christian sect openly to practice its rites, to become a religio licita, a religious cult recognized as non-criminal and legitimate. The second was his decision to shift the center of gravity of the empire away from Italy to a new capital named after himself, Constantinople. Let us consider the religious changes first. What the 18th century believed about Rome, that it was the epitome of the rational tolerance of all religions, was simply wrong. The Roman tradition was welcoming of religions which it could understand as analogous to its own, but it was very severe against those which it found offensive to public decency, to be a superstitio. For example, in 186 BC, hundreds of adepts of the god Bacchus in southern Italy were arrested and publicly executed. Another characteristic of Roman religion was that it was indistinguishable from the Roman state. The priesthood was a temporary office of state, exercised alongside a magistracy or a military command. Thus, high nobles would aspire to co-option to the Collegium Pontificum, the College of Pontifexes, whose leader was the Pontifex Maximus. Later, the emperor abrogated this title to himself, from whom it again later descended to the bishops of Rome. Accordingly, violation of religious laws was punishable as a crime against the community, often carrying the death penalty. This attitude and legal institution is the background to the medieval practice of the condemnation of heretics. Heresy, or airesis in Greek, means a chooser who makes different claims about the divinity. It was used by St. Paul in the sense of a disturber of the community's unity of spirit, and later more systematically by Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, 177-202 AD, as a designated group in his Adversus Hereses, against the heretics. In the first 3 centuries of the Christian epoch, the most famous persecution of a superstitio was the low-level and intermittent persecution of the Christians. Under Diocletian and Galerius, this suppression became a campaign of great severity aimed at the extirpation of the cult. It was from these 8 years that the majority of the actual and of the legendary martyrs of the Church died for their beliefs. These 8 years of excruciating self-sacrifice saw the solidification of the Christian community into an extremely powerful and ineradicable millennial movement. It is often said that Constantine's conversion to Christianity was a cynical act of power politics. Our modern mentality, ever seeking what we think of as rational self-interest, underneath the stated motives of historical actors, is more comfortable with this explanation. But here are the words of the man himself, writing to the bishops of Roman Africa against the Donatist heresy there. Quote, "Since this is certainly the will of the Supreme God, who, as the author of this world and its Father, it is not doubtful that heresies and schism have come from the devil, who is the head of wickedness. For their criminal purpose always requires them, the heretics, to do the works of the devil." End quote. This is the authentic voice of a fully elaborated and sincere Christian, and it expresses a form of Christianity which could have come from the pen of any pope or king up to the early 19th century. This is the Christianity that emerged from the Great Persecution, which ended in 311. This letter dates from 330. Over the following decades, the emperors would take the side of the Christian bishops and, in a breathtaking reversal, stepwise reduce the worship of the ancient pantheon of the Roman gods to a criminal act. Emperors Gratian, Valentinian, and Theodosius issued the basic decree, Cunctus Populus, establishing Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, dated the 27th of February, 380 AD. According to this, all people of the empire, that is, of the world, should live secundum apostolicam disciplinam et evangelicam doctrinam, in consonance with the apostolic instruction and evangelical teaching. From this moment in time, Roman and Christian became synonymous terms. We are accustomed to think that Christianity was inherently hostile to the Roman state, that it usurped and replaced ancient culture with a new, so-called Judeo-Christian one. This is a misunderstanding on a grand scale, in my view. The early Christians, the generation which underwent the Great Persecution, of course primarily thought of themselves as the spiritual elite, the saved as opposed to the damned. But they also understood themselves as nothing other than full members of Roman society and as loyal subjects of the emperors. They regarded the old religion, the gods of Olympus and of the Roman pantheon, as devil worship, and would stop at nothing until it was eliminated. They got their way. I think it was rather the case that Christianity fitted in very well indeed with many of the mainstream religious assumptions and beliefs of the ancient pagan world. The idea of a god taking on the body of a man was as old as religion itself. All the Olympian gods had corporeal form. It was Christianity's roots in Judaism that was horrified at such an idea. The virgin birth was no obstacle to credence. Nymphs had been mysteriously found to be with child through divine agency in many mythic narratives. Nor was the idea of three gods a problem to this monotheism. The deep cultural reflex to conceive of the divine cosmos as a densely populated overworld, complete with a plurality of gods, had its effect. The logical contradiction was finessed by insisting that the divine persons, three of them, were in fact facets of the same undivided God. Indeed, the key Christian doctrine of the Trinity is a perfect expression of the magnetic pull of Mediterranean culture, irresistible and transformative, as it absorbed a set of writings emanating from monotheistic Judea.
Pater cosmon, Pater aionon, melpomen homo, pasaiter zeu, logimoi dulai.
And how did a movement of Jews, for Jews and about Israel, a phenomenon wholly within Judaism in Galilee and Judea, become, within a few decades, an overwhelmingly Gentile, that is, an Hellenic religious sect? For that is what happened gradually between about 40 and 70 AD. When the followers of Yehoshua, or Jesus in Greek, when the small coterie who had known Jesus recovered from the shock of his crucifixion and felt inspired at the Pentecost to spread the message of their dead and, as they already believed, resurrected Rabbi, they went out into a Jerusalem which was, after over 300 years since the conquest of Alexander the Great, heavily overlain with Greek culture and governed with the firm hand of the Roman praefectus. In Greek, or as it is called Hellenic culture, Judaism was up against a civilization of immense sophistication, of great intellectual and artistic power, backed by and embodied in the irresistible Roman state. The tensions in this situation, political and cultural, were explosive. Would Israel assimilate to blend into the broader Græco-Roman Mediterranean civilization, or would it reject it root and branch and succeed in expelling it with violence? A partial and patchy assimilation to Græco-Roman life was already in train. There were substantial Jewish communities in the main cities of the Greek-speaking Near East, in Damascus, at Antioch, founded by one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus, but above all at Alexandria in Egypt. In this city, 200 years previously, the Macedonian king Ptolemaeus Philadelphos had commissioned the translation of the Hebrew Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, into Greek. This became known as the Septuaginta in Latin, or the 70. It had 70 translators. Many Jews living outside Judea had already lost the use of Hebrew as their spoken language and spoke now only Greek. The Septuaginta was their only source for Jewish scripture. It was also by the same token an open book to any Greek speaker who might be interested in Judaism and its religious claims. The synagogues, a Greek word meaning a meeting place, of the diaspora, another Greek word, were often well attended by these Gentiles, drawn to a form of Judaism practiced in Greek. They were called the Theophobes, or God-fearers. Thus it was that the initial audience of the Jewish followers of Jesus was found among these Greek-speaking, half-assimilated Jews, and especially among their Gentile companions at the synagogues. These Hellenic Near Easterners began joining the movement in large numbers. Very quickly, though, it became apparent that Jews themselves, at Jerusalem and in the synagogues of the diaspora, were either indifferent or more usually violently hostile to these renegade Jews from Galilee, preaching a messianic message which excited their intense distaste. The first mission of the original Christian community of Jerusalem, then, that to their fellow Jews, was an almost complete and disastrous failure. I say almost because at least one among them, a fanatical hunter and persecutor of this Jewish subsect, was a Greek-speaking Jew of the diaspora himself, one Paulus of Tarsus, whose parents were well-to-do enough to be accorded the rare and precious status of Roman citizenship. Paulus, or Paul, appears to have been suffering from that condition of many from one culture who are half assimilated to another. He went through a period of violent rejection of his Hellenic background and sought to become a thoroughgoing Orthodox Jew again. The tension was too great. He witnessed, and perhaps took part in, the stoning to death of Stephanos, a Hellenized Jew of the inner circle of the Jerusalem Jesus followers. Then came his famous metanoia, or conversion, on the road to Damascus. Jesus had been dead some years before these events, and Paulus never had seen him. His intense and visionary mind saw in the idea of a God who deliberately chose to undergo the worst humiliation and torment that a man could experience, and yet remain a facet of God, as a new dispensation, one which for him overthrew the law of Moses as his own religious tradition understood it. In the workshop of his fervid mind he fashioned out an entirely new theology. Paulus in effect Hellenized central themes in Judaic apocalyptic lore, such as the coming of the kingdom. In effect he de-ethnicized these themes, applying what had been the exclusive possession of the Israelites to all humanity, that is, to the whole Mediterranean culture. By the 70s AD, things had changed quite drastically. Judea had finally exploded in 66, when, according to Josephus, some Greeks sacrificed a couple of birds in the vicinity of a synagogue. It took 3 Roman legions 5 years finally to crush all armed resistance. Jerusalem fell after a long and desperate siege in September 70 AD. These momentous occurrences, the almost complete rejection by mainstream Jews of the proselytizing of the Jesus followers, and the outbreak of the Great Jewish Revolt, followed by the destruction of the temple by Titus and the dispersion of the Jewish population, profoundly influenced the 4 Gospels, those retrospective literary constructions of the life and meaning of Jesus, which have come down to us. The word gospel is an ancient Anglo-Saxon translation of the Greek euangelion, which literally means beneficial message. We get our word angel from the same Greek root. An angel, as in euangelion, evangel, was a messenger from heaven. The Germanic term gospel is composed of the terms God, meaning good, and spell, meaning story. Among the tribal barbarians of the north, a good story told in the darkness around the evening fire had something of the magical power of a spell about it. Of those accounts of the biography of Jesus, 4 have made it into the canon. The concept of defining which early Christian writing was canonical was spurred by the challenge of Marcion in about 150 AD, who rejected outright all those writings which connected Christianity with the Judaic religious tradition. He was declared heretical and expelled. The canon then, over the following century, solidified into a list of specified writings, originally in the form of separate papyrus scrolls. This solidification coincided with a Roman technical innovation, where writings were bound together in a new form of the book, with pages, a spine, and a cover, which revolutionized literacy in the ancient world. It also worked to transform Christianity, making it possible to speak of ta biblia, the books, as a single object. This occurred by about the 230s AD. This is where we get our concept of the Bible. The plural became the singular about 200 years after the death of Jesus. The authors of the 4 Gospels have by naive tradition been fitted out with personal names: Marcos, Matthias, Lucas, Johannes, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. These accounts were written long after the death of Jesus in 30 AD. For 2 or 3 decades, the memories of the Jesus followers were preserved and elaborated in stories and anecdotes passed around orally. The writer labeled Marcus was clearly a Gentile, that is, a bearer of Græco-Roman and not Jewish culture. At some time in the 60s AD, he set about preserving the Jesus sayings and biographical anecdotes, possibly using some texts such as the supposed Quelle or source that modern scholars assume existed. In doing so, he fashioned a new literary genre, the Evangelion or Evangel. Reflecting the realities of a Christianity 3 decades after Jesus' execution, when the audience addressed was entirely Greek-speaking. This text was written in Greek, as were all later evangels and most other Christian writings from this period. As a person of non-Jewish culture, Marcus confronted the painful paradox that Jesus' original audience, the Jews, had by 60 AD clearly rejected all approaches from the Jesus followers or Christians. Indeed, the word Christian comes from this time. They were constantly telling the Jews and God-fearers of the diaspora synagogues that the delivering Messiah had already come, and that he was Jesus. They, of course, used the term from the Septuaginta, Christos, meaning he who is anointed with oil, the literal meaning of Messiah. People in turn labeled them as Christianoi, or Christiani in Latin. Marcus solved the conundrum of the Jewishness of Jesus and of the rejection of Christianity by Israel by dramatizing Jesus' biography into a story in which the Jews of Jerusalem, and in particular the chief of the Sanhedrin temple authorities, Caiaphas, made the deliberate choice to reject and kill him. Marcus made Jesus' whole life culminate in this moment before Caiaphas, to whom he reveals himself as the Son of Man, etc. 30 years after the events he purports to describe, Marcus places the blame for the rejection and death of Jesus squarely on the shoulders of the Judaic religious authorities. He also causally, if symbolically, links the moment of Jesus' death on the cross with the tearing of the curtain in the Holy of Holies of the Jewish temple, and thus to its physical destruction, which had happened around the time he was writing. This telescoping of the realities and perceptions of the 60s and 70s AD back into the highly approximate, but magnificently dramatic sketch of the historical biography of Jesus 3 or 4 decades earlier shows that the break of Christianity from its Judaic origins was already definitive. The Gospels, the foundation texts of Christianity for the past 2,000 years, are largely based on the dramatized and pathos-filled story of the malicious rejection of the Son of Man, Son of God, etc., by the Jews. It is no wonder that there has been a very long and repeatedly disastrous relationship between Christians and those Jewish communities living within Christendom. The Gospels of Matthias, Matthew, and Lucas, Luke, were written by the generation following Marcus, that is, about half a century after Jesus had lived. In the Matthew-labeled Gospel, the anti-Judaic theme is pushed to its most vehement expression when the praefectus Pilatus offers the release of one of the condemned men before him, and the crowd deliberately called for Barabbas instead of Jesus. Pilatus, the Roman powerholder, is exonerated in this scene when he asks, "What evil has this man done?" The crowd roar back, "Staurotheto, let him be crucified." Lucas is the least accusatory of the 4 evangelists vis-à-vis Judaism. The Jews in his account merely fail to understand what is before them. With Ioannes or John's writings, we are later still, in the 90s or perhaps in the early 100s AD, and things have moved on further. Not only is the content of Jesus' life the story now of a temporary visitor from heaven, Jesus is explicitly a God, an emanation of the Greek philosophic logos, but also a keen sense of an imminent second coming, the immediate end of days, of judgment and of the kingdom of heaven being opened to the saved is dissipated. Ioannes is living in a world where the collective physical salvation, the parousia, is now indefinitely postponed, and the routinization and institutionalization of pistis, or faith, is on the horizon. As the charismatic moment passed, so did the ecclesia, or assembly of the faithful, necessarily become more systematized in dogma and organization. One of the most consequential features that Christianity took over from the Roman world was its formidable ecclesiastical organization and discipline. Its bishops and deacons were humility's own magistrates. The Church's hierarchy of spiritual leaders was rational in an organizational sense. Each community had its own bishop, with sole authority within his diocese, another overtly Roman administrative term. The Christian Church absorbed the sense of a klerus, an order, a disciplined corporation set apart, of dedicated specialists, the clergy, inheriting God's tasks on earth, as opposed to a laicus, originally an inexpert person, one not in possession of a techne, as doctors called those who are not doctors. In Judaism and in Islam, there is no equivalent. The rabbi and the imam are conceived of as learned in the scriptures. They are scholars. This organizational structure came to reflect the culture of the Roman Empire itself. The Christian bishop's area of jurisdiction was the civitas, the main city with its surrounding countryside. There was one bishop per civitas, who came with time to possess secular as well as ecclesiastical power. The Roman legal tradition, its hierarchy of command, its documentary and rhetorical methods, all these aspects and many more were naturally absorbed into the tissue and ethos of the Christian Church. When he ordained the toleration and then the privileged elevation of the Christian Church, Constantine soon discovered that he faced a turbulent body of factional and determined bishops. The Roman state found itself having to negotiate with a parallel institutional power. When Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the first general council of the Christian Church, and presided personally over its sessions, he inaugurated a new model of the res publica, or republic, with the religious leaders of the people forming the synodos, or synod, that is, those who travelled to meet, from odos, meaning a journey, who acted as a clerical senate, debating under the auspices of the emperor. This model of the political community lasted, with modifications, until the very end of the Middle Ages, that is, until the summer of 1789. It is more fruitful then to consider Christianity not as the opponent and destroyer of Roman civilization, but as its culmination and completion. The great sophisticated culture of the Mediterranean embraced a set of religious ideas that had originated in an obscure heresy within Judaism. As these ideas leaped what we might call the cultural species barrier, through the agency of St. Paul, they themselves were as much changed and adapted as they worked a great change within the receiving culture. Such a two-way process is entirely natural and to be expected. The distinguishing outward features of Christianity, for example its architectural form, the basilica was a Roman law court, and its rich and extremely elaborate sculptural and pictorial representations of the divine, these features are alien to any monotheistic religion. Judaism and Islam, and some strands of fundamentalist Protestantism, are scandalized by representations of the divine. But from the earliest times, Christians had depicted themselves in religious settings, and did not shrink from depicting their God. In the earliest Christian funerary frescoes in the Roman catacombs, Jesus as God is represented as a central figure, sometimes painted wearing a simple Roman tunic with a Roman haircut. If Christianity had not melded with ancient Mediterranean culture and rejected monotheism's abhorrence of images, we would have no representational artistic tradition in this civilization. In painting and in sculpture, the natural human form is Europe's most characteristic excellence. No other civilization has matched it. Without this blending, we would have no museums and art galleries today. To gain acceptance and respectability in the ancient world, the Christian leaders had to counter the arguments of the philosophers, and to do so using the methods and standards of philosophy. This process went on for several centuries. The result was the ascendancy of the discipline of theology, which remained the supreme science or body of knowledge of our civilization until the late 17th century. The Greek philosophical outlook, vocabulary, and its dialectical method were preserved by the Christian fathers. They knew no other way of formulating their higher ideas. The content of Greek thought was to some degree negatively preserved by them also, as the object of their polemics, thereby unintentionally smuggling the long-sleeping larva of rationalist philosophy into the new Christian civilization. Other features of our culture today were initiated in this immensely formative period. For example, the shape of our week. By an imperial edict of 321 AD, Constantine made legally binding throughout the empire, for pagans and Christians alike, a justitium, or a suspension of public business, on the dies solis, or sun day. Christians called it the Lord's Day, or Dies Domini. In the German-speaking parts of Europe and the West, we still use the old pagan names as the Romans and sub-Romans did: Sun Day, Moon Day, Woden's Day, Freya's Day. But in the Latin-speaking parts of Europe, they say Dies Domini, such as dimanche in French, domingo in Spanish, and domenica in Italian. From 392 AD, further laws forced the theatres to shut on Sundays, so that people could or should attend religious services. This tradition has only begun to dissolve in the theatre business in recent decades. And while mentioning theatre, we might note that this cultural phenomenon, in its human-centered essence, in its mastering genres of tragedy and comedy, is also a unique and unbroken thread in European civilization, which did not expire at the end of the ancient culture, but continued throughout Europe's entire history. Between 500 and 1500 AD, that drama took a largely religious form in the staging of tableaux of stories from the Christian scriptures, the living enactment of the scenes we see sculpted and painted on the churches. This was an entirely natural development, since the stories from what we call the New Testament were themselves, in their compositional conception, saturated with the narrative conventions offered by classical literature, for example in the genres of the lives of the philosophers and of the Hellenistic romances. The image of Socrates as a martyr lies in the background as a powerful archetype for early Christian literature. The four evangelists in their time, as Greek-speaking urban dwellers of the Eastern Mediterranean, would have attended, as every literate person did, the expression of that literature in the plays of the theatron, or theatre, which bulked so large in every city's communal life. When, in 54 AD, two members of St. Paul's entourage, Gaius and Aristarchus, were set upon by an enraged crowd of the citizens of Ephesus, they dragged them into the city's theatre, where they arraigned them in the orchestra, while they themselves occupied the stone spectator seats chanting, Megale Artemis Ephesion, Great is the Artemis of the Ephesians. Somewhat less momentous than these religious and social changes was the decision by Constantine to move the political seat of the empire away from Italy, eastwards. The founding of Constantinople upset a very old order. The Latin-speaking West, the Occident, was massively weighted on Italy, with Africa in the second rank. The Occident was less populous, less urbanized, and less wealthy than the Greek and Syriac-speaking East or Orient. And in the north of the Occident, large areas were nothing more than a forested, swampy wilderness. But in the Latin Occident there remained the old Roman Italian pride, now increasingly embodied in the Church, as the great landowning senators migrated into the Christian prelacy. In the 380s and 390s, the final struggle between the universal and traditional pagan religion and the new Christian one took place. Members of the high elite had been among the first to succumb to the new belief system. The majority of the population, however, especially the ordinary people in the countryside, were much less quick to take up the new religion, and popular superstition, or pagan remnants, remained deeply embedded among the peasantry until relatively recent times. But at the formal and official level of society, the final showdown occurred at Rome. The Emperor Gratian ordered the removal of the statue of the winged Victory, or Victoria, from the Senate House at Rome. He also abolished the public stipend supporting the pagan nunnery of the Vestal Virgins, a most ancient and revered Roman institution. These were mortal blows aimed at the old established religion, at its very heart. During the 390s, a series of petitions to his successors, the emperors Valentinian and Theodosius, were composed by the senator Symmachus, called the Relatii, or Relations, based on the very strong argument of the time of Mos Maiorum, ancestral custom. He was countered at the imperial court by the advice of the formidable bishop of Milan, where the court was resident, Ambrosius, who was no less a man of the highest Roman culture than Symmachus. He succeeded in persuading Theodosius not to restore the statue, which Augustus had placed on its plinth in the Senate House 3.5 centuries before. Incidentally, Ambrosius was also instrumental in bringing the choral style of the Eastern Christian Church in Syria to Italy and thereby to the Occident, laying the foundations of one of the major strands of the European musical tradition. Of great importance in the new Christian structure of the empire were the patriarchates, those bishoprics of highly prestigious cities such as Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. These vied with one another for preeminence, especially Rome, Alexandria, and the new upstart Constantinople. Rome had the advantage of its ultra-prestigious patron saints, Saints Peter and Paul, and its status as the traditional home of the empire. But it was also alone in the Occident as the only patriarchate. Before the move of the capital to Constantinople, the previous emperor, Diocletian, had divided the imperial office in two. One emperor, the senior, would live in the Orient, or East, and the lesser would live in the Occident. The city of Rome thereby lost its status as the seat of government. The imperial residences in the West were at Milan or Ravenna, or as military necessity dictated, at Arles in Provence, at Trier on the Rhine, or even at York, Eboracum, in distant Britannia. The dividing line between the Roman Occident and Orient cut down what we call today the Balkans, roughly including modern Croatia in the Occident. Diocletian's division of the empire into the Pars Oriens and Pars Occidens, the eastern and the western parts, was to have enormous structuring consequences for future history. Not only was this political division to be at the root and origin of our term the West and its derivatives such as Western civilization, but its religious, cultural and geopolitical effects were still completely self-evident to anyone who looked at a map, right up until the middle of the 19th century. In the Middle Ages, the region was known as Romānija, the area falling within the sphere of the rule or of the influence of the continuing Roman Empire at Constantinople. From 1350 onwards, for 500 years, under Ottoman dominion, it formed the frontier land of the Islamic world on the continent of Europe. From this time, Western Europeans slowly began using the Turkish term Balkan, meaning the forest mountains, to describe the region. The pushing back of Ottoman power in the mid-19th century allowed local intellectuals to import nationalism from Western Europe, channeling and lending a new virulence to ancient patterns of division between Muslims and Christians, and between Latin and Greek Christians, which erupted into the shockingly atavistic war of the 1990s. Diocletian's arbitrary division still cast its shadow. Today, Croatians look towards Rome and Western Europe, while Serbs look towards Constantinople's presumptive heir, Moscow. It is this world, then, of what has been called the Low Empire, the to us rather obscured area of the Christian Roman Empire, the era of Constantinople as I call it, which has cast such a long shadow over intervening history. In ways we can only discern the traces of, it was this civilizational metamorphosis, from Romano-Hellenic antiquity to medieval Christendom, that laid down the deep cultural foundations of the type of society and culture we experience all around us now. The Western world as it is at the beginning of the 21st century of the Christian epoch, Anno Domini 2010. I use the term AD to name the epoch, and not the recently politically correct term of CE or the Common Era, without embarrassment and with what I believe is complete consistency. Because the idea of being value neutral is a mirage, one cannot think or even perceive from a standpoint outside of one's own cultural inheritance. The following episodes will trace the steps by which we have moved as a culture from Christian antiquity through the long Middle Ages into the modern era, that is, into the current form of Western civilization. We should seek not to throw out the real past and impose our present values retrospectively upon it, but to do justice to the moving perspective of the generations who made the history described, and to treat their memory with the dignity it deserves.